Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Barbara Corrado Pope, Professor Emerita in Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Oregon and founding director of that unit. She also was director of the Robert D. Clark Honors College for 4 years. Barbara's passion for history and devotion to women's studies inspired her to play a prominent role as a leader on campus in fostering the integration of race and gender into the U of O curriculum. Now that she has retired from the double duties of administration and teaching, Barbara is delving into topics that she rarely had the opportunity to address in the classroom, namely French history and the visual arts. On the heels of the release of her first full-length novel, Cézanne's Quarry, Barbara is launching a second novel and will be talking about her creative writing today. Barbara, thanks very much for coming back to campus to speak with us.
My pleasure.
This is a special pleasure for me because I saw your novel take shape over the process of several years, and I'm so glad we have a chance to talk about it. The Boston Globe, one of your many positive reviews, called Cézanne's Quarry a highly accomplished and compelling novel. That's high praise from a big press. Well done.
Thank you.
I know that was an important one in stimulating sales
I was thrilled, of course.
Of course. Can we start at the beginning and ask you what provided the impetus to write this novel?
Well, I think it came from actually two directions. One direction is that I had always wanted to write fiction. And I realized when I looked through my files, when I was teaching, administering, making up new classes, when I was in women's studies, I was constantly creating new courses because it was a new field. That in between, I had attempts at short stories. I was trying to go back to what I thought I would always do before I got on what I call the academic train and never quite got off of it. So that was one impetus. The other one sort of came out of left field. I always thought, as most people think, that your first novel is going to be autobiographical. It's going to go over your life story. And in my particular case, I think I'd like to write about my father. But that's a very hard thing to get to emotionally if you don't feel you have the skills and the talents and the time. And a friend wrote me a letter. She is a labor educator in Iowa City. And she was taking a year off. And she was going to learn Italian, learn to play the piano, lose 25 pounds, and write a novel about Cézanne, Provence, and geology. And I said, this was a great idea. I was so excited about it. And I wrote her back and said, you have to do it. Drop everything else. Do this. Then she said, why don't we do it together? And then finally, we talked about it, and she's a very brilliant person, sort of lightning-quick imagination, but I don't think has the patience to write a novel. So I wrote the novel. And I realized, when you think of the adage, write what you know, wow, I taught in Provence, I know French history, I love art. I'm an amateur in the French sense of a lover of art. I know a lot about Cézanne. It is something I know, so I did it.
It's one of the only cases I know where someone who has been on that academic train that you referred to makes a successful transition to becoming a writer of fiction in really what was a very short amount of time. Well, to those of us on the outside of the writing process, it seems like a short time. Did you have any idea that this first book of yours would be such a success?
No. On the other hand, when I think of writing and writers, and I guess that's something we'll get to today, I've learned to be a little tolerant with myself about what a writer is. You often find writers who say, I can't live without writing. I'm actually a person who's very sociable. I could live without writing. But I never wanted to write anything that someone would not read. It never occurred to me that I wrote for myself, that I put it in a drawer. And so I always had the expectation that eventually what I would write would be read. So
I'd like to explore just a little further how this fiction project arises out of your own intellectual interests. You're trained as a social historian, intellectual historian, and all of that must be the research that feeds into setting a convincing historical novel. Is that correct, would you say?
It's correct, and I'm going to go off in June to the Historical Novel Society and meet a whole lot of other people who came from a very different direction. I think what history gave me is a sense of how people thought and how people talked. and what the big issues of the day were. I mean, this was very natural to me because of my study of history over decades and decades. What history didn't give me, which is very frustrating when you're writing a historical novel, is not do they use a fork. Of course they used a fork, but do they use a fountain pen or do they use an inkwell? What does the cart look like? How did they heat the room? All of these things I have to do research on, which is beyond what I know. But the basic background, the basic feeling for the time and place, I think is what it taught me.
Before we talk about the particulars of the novel, I wanted to ask you about your academic writing. You said you never assumed you would put away your writing in a drawer and it was only for you. Did you also assume that your academic publications were written for a certain readership?
Yeah, I have not written, you know, the immense amount that a lot of other academic writers have written, but everything I've written has been very clear and also got a bigger audience than other writers. For instance, my first article on women's history, which was sort of pioneering, a lot of people read it, a lot of people used it in the classroom, and I never really thought that I would write something so technical that it wouldn't reach a wide audience. I'm an educator. I mean, that's part of what I am.
That's the common vein running through all of this.
Yes.
But how hard was the apprenticeship? You had to learn to write effective descriptions, to write dialogue especially, all those things that we try to convince our students they need to purge from their academic writing. So what about that apprenticeship of learning to become a fiction writer?
Well, I think the big difference is that with academic writing, you're very precise, you're very condensed. You want to be very clear. That's something I learned by, one time I wrote 2 pages on revolution in graduate school, and everyone else in the seminar was very nice and said they liked it. And the teacher said, you want to tell me what was in it? And no one could say what it was at such a level of abstraction. No one knew what it said. And so he wrote down, clarity is your first obligation. And I took that very seriously. The issue with fiction is elaboration, to know when to attenuate, when to condense. And frankly, for me, dialogue is the easiest part of it. Description is the hardest part of it. But I think that varies with writers. It's very much a matter of temperament and what they like to read. So the dialogue was easy, I guess, because I'm a talker.
You came to it naturally.
That's right.
Did you have any hesitations about leaping into the mystery genre, or was that a genre you've appreciated for a long time?
I never thought I would be a mystery writer. Never, never. Except I like them. I like reading them. And when my friend suggested writing this mystery, I just got totally hooked. I said, it's possible. He did it.
Well, so let's talk about this particular novel. Would you give a brief setup so that we know the general story, the general setting?
Well, the novel takes place in 2 hot weeks in Aix-en-Provence in 1885. Now, Aix-en-Provence today is a lively city, lots of students, musical festivals. At the time, it was a town of 20,000 people, very snobbish, very ingrown. And one of the major suspects is Cézanne, the artist Cézanne, who at the time of the novel is 46 years old, has not yet made his name at all. And he's in a very frustrating place. And growing up in Aix-en-Provence, he grew up with Zola, who was someone rejected by the town. And by the time 1885, Zola is the most famous man in France. So there's a lot of things reflecting back on Cézanne, who is in an unhappy relationship with a woman named Hortense Fiquet, has a 13-year-old son, cannot tell his father about it because his father is very stingy and says no man should marry until he can support a wife. So he's in this frustrating position, and a woman is found at the bottom of a quarry who is his secret lover. Now, there are 2 kinds of clues from Cézanne's writing that I used, Cézanne's work. One is that he wrote a letter which says, I tried to kiss her once and she wouldn't let me do it. And we know from that, all his biographers say, he had a secret lover in 1885. But nothing is known about her, as one of them said, except he met her in Aix. So here, this was one part of the setup. The other part is that when he was young, he painted these very erotic and violent paintings, and art historians go around and around the bend of why he did that. And so that's a part of the novel too. The woman in question is named Solange Vernet, who I will introduce to you, and she arrived in town with a geologist. Here's where geology comes in. An Englishman of sort of indefinite background. No one knows where he came from. And he's the second suspect. And the main protagonist is what's called an examining magistrate in France, a judge who investigates the case and decides what the crime should be called and whether it should be sent to court, and usually decides who the suspect is.
We'll get back to your examining magistrate because he's going to be our link to the sequel,
Yes,
I think,
right? Right.
But I'd like to ask you if you would be willing to read us the passage that we talked about briefly. I'd love to have a part of your prose as part of the interview.
Okay.
Which part are you going to read? I believe it's the discovery of the body?
It's the discovery of the body. A veteran inspector, Albert Frank, has come to the attic room of Bernard Martin, who is this examining magistrate, poorer than the other judges. They usually come from upper classes. And he's been left sort of in charge because no one expects anything will happen in August and X because it's a dead town, after all. And so they go up the Quarry Road, and they're looking for the body. And as they're looking for it, Albert Frank finds a piece of canvas shivering on a branch. And he goes, aha, and he pockets it. And this is actually authentically historical, too, because Cézanne used to tear up his canvases when he was frustrated.
And just to recall something you said, this is in the hot, hot southern climate of Provence,
Right.
so under the blazing summer sun.
And the strange red earth, and the clear blue sky. Right.
All right, I think we're
All those
ready.
things. Okay, so they finally come upon the quarry. She lay in shadow and light, half hidden by the remains of the quarryman's work. As Martin approached, he saw an unmistakable sign that it was she. Her hair, unbound, shining under the rays of a merciless setting sun, looked like it had burst into flames. That magnificent golden red hair, which he had always seen pinned up, rising gracefully from her long white neck. Beneath her now, radiating from her shoulder to her waist, was a pool of dark blood, long dried by the heat. Martin wanted to reach down, excuse me, to drive the buzzing flies from her body, but he could not move. By contrast, Frank paid little regard to ceremony. Putting his booted foot under her waist, the veteran rolled her over, and then Martin saw her face, that once beautiful face, now locked forever in a grotesque death mask. My God, thought Martin, this is not right. The day's sensations, like the shooting rays of the sun, overtook him with furious intensity. Where he had once caught a whiff of perfume, he now smelled human remains. The heat, the odor of death, and the incessant rasping of the cicadas were making him dizzy. Afraid he would be sick, he let himself drop to a seat provided by a boulder. Do you know her, sir? What? I asked if you knew her. Yes, no. Both answers were true, and what little he did know of her, he was not about to tell Frank. You know who she is, then. Martin nodded and buried his head in his hands, willing his nausea to subside. Barely managing to raise his voice above the roar of the insects, he mumbled, "It is Solange Vernet." Martin had met Solange Vernet early that spring at a bookstore near the Hôtel de Ville. He had gone to look for a recent edition of The Origin of Species. Because he did not yet know the political sentiments of the bookseller, he searched for Darwin himself. He found Solange Vernet reading the book at the back of the store. So concentrated had she been, her white hat hanging by a green satin ribbon around her neck, parasol leaning against the wall, brow furrowed with diligence, that she hadn't even noticed him until he was almost upon her. But she did not jump back or back away. She smiled, a beautiful smile, warm and mischievous at the same time. "Could you be looking for this?" she asked, turning her attention from the book to his face. Martin backed away, demurring, insisting that, "No, please," she interrupted. "We have a copy in English at home. I was only interested because, look here, see." With one white-gloved finger, she pointed to the title page. "It is translated by a woman, Clémence Royer. I heard her give a series of lectures on philosophy and science in Paris." "Yes," Martin answered. Very brilliant, isn't she? But also something of a scandal, no. Hoping that by conveying this knowledge he would conceal how much she shared the opinions of those who hooted and howled at the very idea of a woman speaking in public about such matters. You've heard her then. You've lived in Paris. Only for 3 years. I was in the law faculty, spending most of my time being boring, I fear, studying for exams. He often asked himself why he had said so much. He kept coming back to the admission that he had wanted this woman, this beautiful stranger, to argue against his modest assessment. He remembered that her eyes, so merry and direct, were green, and that they matched the emeralds in her earrings. Never had he noticed this much about a woman before.
Wow. It makes me want to start over from the beginning, and I've already read the book.
Well,
that's a very well-chosen tidbit. And I know you've been doing a lot of readings, both on the West Coast and some in the East as well, right? How broadly have you been on your author's tour with the work?
Well, a tour, I think, is an elevated idea of what goes on when you publish a book. But I've been to Brooklyn, Boston, New Jersey, and then Seattle, Portland, Berkeley, Lincoln City.
That's an important stop.
Coos Bay. Actually, you never know what's going to be the most fun or where you're going to get the biggest audience. So.
I want to get back to the marketing part of this, but first I'd like to engage again a little bit the deep, dense historical underlay of this particular novel. I think it's very brave of you to wade into something where you're talking about Paul Cézanne, arguably the best known and most successful of the painters of his generation, backdrop of Émile Zola, arguably the best naturalist author of the 19th century, to take on Darwin and what Darwin meant for the values and interests and intellectual contours of that society. You were not willing to hide behind the anonymous 19th century. You leapt right into the blockbusters. Did you find that intimidating in any way?
No, I didn't. And actually, it all came from the idea, the theme. I mean, once, and that's true with the second one, too. Once I had sort of a theme, then everything else came from it. And also, I feel I know a lot about Cézanne. I know a lot about Zola. I just feel that. And one of the interesting things that's happened to me since I wrote this is when you write fiction, you get lots of mail from lots of people. It's wonderful. And I opened up my email one day and it said, A. Cézanne. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, it's a hoax. And then I opened it up and it said, hello, Barbara Corrado Pope. My name is Aline Cézanne. I'm the great-granddaughter of Paul Cézanne. And my next thought was, she's going to sue me. It turns out, though, that she liked the book and she wanted me to sign it. She lives in San Francisco. And when I spoke in Berkeley, she came and we had brunch together the next day.
That's extraordinary.
And she thinks it's very amusing that I pictured her great-grandfather as a major murder suspect.
Did she know a lot about her great-grandfather?
What she knows, I think, is mostly family lore. She knew her grandfather, who's Paul Jr., and certainly her own father. And she knew Jean Renoir. I mean, there's a huge link between the Renoirs and the Cézannes. So she knew all these people, but I think there's family lore. And she said, you know, he was sort of grumpy on the outside and soft in the inside, which I think is the way I depicted him and the way I thought of him. So I think she liked the depiction.
How wonderful to have an informal family endorsement for the project.
Right.
On the question of a woman translator, a woman engrossed in reading Darwin in a bookstore, it seems to me as though you did actively work in your long-standing interest in gender issues into the book.
This is true. I mean, I had one concern, which is there's so much talk in women's studies about violence against women. I thought, oh my goodness, here I'm writing a book where a woman is murdered. And I said, oh, can I do this in terms of am I violating what I've been standing up for a long time? But then I thought to myself, you're in this book, and who you are is in this book, and it's going to come out, and it's going to come out with a real concern for women. And I think that especially the Boston Globe was very interested in the fact that I showed women of all walks of life and showed what women could be and what women could do. And of course, when they stepped outside the bounds, how much trouble they had.
One of the things that you've had to contend with is the publicity machine that one has to
Yes.
launch in order to make a book like this successful. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think unknown authors have two experiences. One experience is that you get into a big publisher who will provide you with a lot of that. My publisher is a relatively small, very good publisher, but a small publisher in New York. And they provided me with what's called the pre-publicity. They made sure that I got reviews in all of the sort of pre-publication things like Publishers Weekly and Library Journal and Kirkus. So I got those and got into a lot of public libraries. But after that, it was sort of up to me to decide how to proceed with promotion. And I can tell you that this is something I did not want to do. I mean, I buried my head. People said, get a website, do this, do that, get a publicist. Eventually, I did do all those things, perhaps a little late, who knows. But you're just sort of at sea, and you have to work your way through it, and you just find people who will give you advice about how to do it, and I did.
It's been quite an education, though, hasn't it?
It's been quite an education, yeah. But you realize it's necessary. You walk not only into any bookstore, but say a mystery bookstore, and I get vertigo just looking at all those books that everyone's written. And I thought, well, how am I going to get noticed? So you have to figure out ways to do it. Yeah.
It's a whole new ballgame for those of us in the academic field, I think, and that must have been brought home to you. Your husband, Daniel Pope, came out with an academic book just at the same time as Cézanne's Quarry was published. So you, in the household, you had that contrast going on.
Well, it was really nice. Daniel likes the computers much more than I did. So he checks up to see, he finds all the reviews, he finds how many public libraries have taken the book. So he does all that for me. And he also learned a little bit about publicizing his own book, which he had never thought to do. The contrast, for people who don't know, is obviously for an academic writer, the prestige of the publisher is probably the most important thing. And you really don't care whether it's 500 or 125 or 5,000 people who buy it. For a fiction publisher, you must sell enough books to be a viable author. I think that's the big thing. I never thought my first book was going to be a bestseller. It didn't even occur to me. But I thought I have to sell enough books so that I'm viable and that someone will want to publish the second and the third. And that's where the difficulty can be, actually.
So that's why it's worth investing in this whole machinery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know the book's already been translated into German, and it's selling like hotcakes in Germany. It's also going to be translated into Polish?
Yes.
Any other languages in sight?
No, so far it's only German and Polish.
Do you know why it was picked up by German and Polish presses?
No, I don't. And some people say, why not in French? And I think it's because a lot of the French say, we should write about ourselves. I think there's a lot of that attitude. With German publications, it's a big reading audience. And what you find out is all of a sudden you're in a writer's community, which is different from an academic community. And what you find out is a lot of books are published in German. And I think it's just because per capita, more people read books in Germany. Polish, I'm not sure why, but they picked it up. It's out. It's pretty.
Well, I'm sure it won't be too long before it goes into other continents as well. I don't want to spoil the plot, so I won't talk about how this ends, but I wonder if you could give us a little bit of an insight into what the sequel is going to be about.
Well, the sequel has very little to do with this, except two characters are carried on. There is Bernard Martin, the examining magistrate, and the woman he meets, Quarry, in this novel. And they're married about 10 years later. And they end up in a town called Nancy. And I came to this novel in this place because I decided I wanted to write about the rise of the new anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century in France. And I don't know why. I think perhaps it was all my work with race and gender in women's studies. And that is a huge issue. It's not only the Dreyfus Affair, for people who know about that, but there was a huge bestseller by Edouard Drumont called La France Juive. and there were anti-Semitic newspapers. And so I wanted to pick a community where that would be a vital issue and where there would be a big Jewish community. And there were only a few places in France where that would be, so I moved Quarry, who's now a teacher, and Bernard up to the court at Nancy.
The title, at least the tentative title, is The Blood of Lorraine, right?
Yes.
Does that indicate the geographic location of this
Yes.
setting?
Nancy is the capital of Lorraine, and for those who know anything about French history, this was a period when 2 parts of France, Alsace and a third of Lorraine, were cut off because of the Franco-Prussian War. They went into Germany. So there's a lot of tension right there in this town. And The Blood of Lorraine, the meaning of it is not that it should be a thriller, but who is really the blood of Lorraine? Is it people who are only Christian Frenchmen, or is it Jews too?
So it's not a reference to blood being spilled in Lorraine.
Well, there will be blood spilled, of course. One of the great things about being a mystery writer is you're God. You say, well, should I kill another one? Should it be a baby? Whatever.
It's a great title because it has all those possibilities in it. I know you did research in Nancy. You spent some time there. Anything? Have you got as much as you need now to flesh out that book?
I think so. What you really need in going right now in our world with books and the internet is a sense of the place. And the other thing I needed, and it seems very strange, is these souvenir picture books you have of 19th century Nancy, which you can only get when you go to the town. So I've spent 2 different periods of there and 2 different parts of the main part of town, got 2 very important picture books, so now I know what a horse-drawn tram looks like and things like that. And I think I have. I also have friends there now that I can write if I really need it.
That sounds great. I can't wait, for one, to read the second novel, and I want to wish you lots of success. You're a great example of a crossover author, and you inspire all of us who are still holding our academic jobs and writing for the academic presses. Barbara, thank you for coming today.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you very much for watching today. We've been speaking with Barbara Corrado Pope, author of Cézanne's Quarry and Professor Emerita, UO Women's and Gender Studies.